In 1894, a team of German archaeologists working in the ruins of ancient Nippur pulled a small clay tablet from the mud. It was cracked across the middle, no bigger than a man's palm, and covered in the tiny wedge-shaped marks the Sumerians used to write more than 4,000 years ago. The tablet was catalogued, numbered, and sent back to a museum in Berlin, where it sat in a wooden drawer for the next 70 years. Nobody read it, nobody translated it. It was one of thousands of fragments waiting for someone to care. Then, in 1962, a linguist named Heinrich Otten opened that drawer looking for something else. He was studying the phonetic structure of early cuneiform, and he needed reference samples. He pulled out the Nippur fragment, laid it on his desk, and began the slow work of transliteration. Within an hour, he stopped. Within a day, he called a colleague. Within a week, he refused to publish what he had found. The tablet contained a passage that made no sense inside any accepted framework of ancient history. It described a category of human beings who felt what the scribe called a longing for a place they had never physically visited. Not a longing for a lost homeland the way exiles feel it. Not a spiritual yearning the way mystics describe. Something specific. Something the scribe wrote about as a documented condition, with symptoms, with a name, and with a warning about what happens to people who feel it. And the place these humans longed for, according to the tablet, was not on Earth. Otten never published his full translation. He died in 2010. His notes were donated to a private archive in Munich. For 60 years, the Nippur fragment sat in that Berlin drawer, catalogued but essentially invisible, its contents known to perhaps 4 people in the world. Then, in 2019, an independent researcher gained access to the archive, photographed the Otten notes, and cross-referenced them against the original tablet, which had been moved to a secure storage facility during a museum renovation. What she found matched Otten's work almost exactly, and it opened a question that mainstream scholarship has spent the last 4 years trying not to answer. To understand why Otten refused to publish, you have to understand the man himself. He was not a fringe thinker. He was one of the most methodical linguists of his generation, a specialist in Hittite and early Sumerian, known among his colleagues for a caution that bordered on paralysis. He would not publish a translation until he had verified every character 3 separate times. His published papers are cited in almost every serious study of ancient Near Eastern languages produced in the last 50 years. He was, by every measure that mattered inside the field, an unimpeachable source. And that is precisely why what he found in the Berlin drawer was so difficult for him to handle. He could not dismiss it, because his own method would not let him. His personal correspondence from that period, which survives in the Munich archive, shows a man wrestling with something he could not put down. In one letter to a colleague at Heidelberg, he wrote that he had encountered a text that would either be considered the most important cuneiform document of the 20th century, or would end his career if he associated his name with it publicly. The colleague never responded in writing. Otten stopped mentioning the tablet in correspondence within a year. But he did not stop working on it. He returned to the fragment for the next 4 decades. He never published any of it. The tablet is small. It is unremarkable to look at. If you saw it in a museum case, you would walk past it without noticing. It is a working document produced by a temple scribe on an ordinary afternoon in a city that no longer exists. And it may contain a piece of information about the human species that was preserved almost entirely by accident. The question is this: why did a Sumerian scribe 4,000 years ago take the time to describe a specific psychological condition affecting a subset of the human population, and why did he insist that the place these people missed was somewhere the rest of humanity had never been? And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they specified down to the degree, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The tablet was labeled by Otten in his private notes as fragment N-4-7, though its official museum designation is longer and more clinical. In his working papers, Otten described the physical object in careful detail. It measured roughly 9 centimeters by 6 centimeters. The clay was reddish-brown, fired at a low temperature, which suggested it was not intended as a formal record, but as a working document, perhaps a copy of a longer text, or a personal reference kept by a temple official. The script was early Standard Sumerian, with occasional Akkadian glosses in the margins, which dates the writing to a specific transitional period when scribes were beginning to use both languages side by side. The passage that stopped Otten begins about a third of the way down the front face of the tablet. It opens with a common formula that translates roughly as, concerning those who cannot rest. This phrase, in Sumerian medical and religious texts, usually introduces a discussion of insomnia, spiritual affliction, or possession by minor demons. Aten expected a familiar catalog of symptoms and remedies. What he got instead was something no other cuneiform text he had ever read contained. The scribe wrote that there existed among the population a certain kind of person who could not be soothed by the ordinary means. These people, he said, had homes, families, land, occupations. They lived in the cities of the plain. They ate the bread of the land and drank its water. And yet from childhood, they carried a heaviness that no priest could lift and no offering could satisfy. The scribe called this heaviness by a compound term that Aten translated as the aching for the other sky. The other sky. Not the sky above them, another sky, a specific one. The tablet then does something that ancient texts almost never do. It describes symptoms in clinical terms. The affected individuals, the scribe wrote, tended to gaze upward at night with what he called an unnatural attention, particularly toward a region of the heavens. He identified using a set of star groupings that Aten spent years trying to map. They dreamed frequently of landscapes that did not match the deserts or mountains of Mesopotamia. They described colors that did not exist in the world around them, and lights that behaved in ways that fire and sun and moon did not behave. They were prone to periods of what he called a quiet grief, in which they would sit apart from their families and speak of a place they wanted to go back to, though none of them had ever been anywhere but the cities of their birth. Aten's marginal note next to this passage, written in German, translates as, "This is not a metaphor. He was right to be careful." A less rigorous scholar might have read the passage as poetic language, a lament, a mythological flourish. But the tablet's own structure argued against that reading. The scribe was writing in a documentary register, using the same vocabulary he would have used to describe a fever or a broken bone. He was cataloging a condition, and he was doing it because someone, presumably a temple authority, had asked him to. The tablet was, in other words, a work order. Someone in the Sumerian religious hierarchy had encountered enough of these affected individuals that they had asked a scribe to produce a formal description. The scribe was not writing for himself. He was writing for a system of priests who needed to know how to identify the condition when it walked into their temple, and what to do when the standard rituals of healing failed. That framing changes how we read every word of the passage. It is not a story, it is a diagnostic aid. The next section of the tablet gets more specific, and this is where the modern researcher who accessed the Munich archive found her work overlapping with recent developments in an entirely different field. The scribe wrote that these afflicted individuals shared certain physical traits. He listed them in a short sequence: eyes that responded strangely to bright light, a tendency toward what he called a light bone structure, which Aten interpreted as unusual height combined with slender build, a pattern of dreams that began in early childhood and intensified around the onset of adult reasoning, and, most curiously, a kind of magnetic sensitivity, which the scribe described as the ability to feel the presence of storms and certain metals before others could perceive them. None of these traits, taken individually, is particularly remarkable, but the fact that a Sumerian scribe grouped them together 4,000 years ago and attached them to a specific psychological condition involving longing for a place off the earth is the kind of thing that makes serious researchers stop and reread the passage several times before saying anything out loud. Aten reread it many times. His notes contain 7 separate attempts at translating the compound term for the condition itself. His final rendering, the one he settled on late in his career, was the following phrase: "The remembering sickness of those who came from elsewhere." The remembering sickness, not longing, not homesickness in the ordinary sense, a sickness of memory, a condition in which a person remembers something they have no biological right to remember. The tablet does not stop there. After describing the condition, the scribe moves into what appears to be an explanation, though the language becomes more compressed and more difficult in this section. Aten's notes indicate that he spent nearly 2 years on the next 12 lines alone. What he eventually produced is a passage that reads, in his translation, as follows: "These are the ones whose fathers' fathers were not of this ground. In the time before the counting, when the great ones walked the plain, some among them took wives from the daughters of the land, and some took husbands from the sons of the land, and from these unions came children who were of both bloods. The children of the mixed blood were told nothing, for the great ones went away in the ships of fire, and the mothers and fathers who remained were bound by an oath. But the blood remembered. Even when the mouth forgot, the blood remembered. And so, in every generation since, there are those who wake in the night, and weep for a place their eyes have never seen, and their families do not understand, and the priest cannot heal them, for the sickness is not of the body or of the spirit, but of the deeper thing that lives in the marrow. The passage ends there. The next several lines of the tablet are damaged, and Aten could not reconstruct them with confidence. Read that passage again in your mind. A Sumerian scribe, writing more than 4,000 years ago, is describing a hereditary condition passed down through generations from ancestors who were not human, or at least not from this ground, and who left in ships of fire, and whose descendants, thousands of years later, still feel a longing for the place their ancestors came from. He is not writing this as a myth. He is writing it as a medical observation, delivered in the same tone he would use to describe a broken arm. Before we move on to the next code, stop for a second. What you just heard about the remembering sickness is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Sumerian notation. The population number, the trigger conditions, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The passage raises an obvious question that mainstream scholarship has spent decades avoiding. If we take the tablet at face value, then the Sumerian scribe was describing something our modern categories of history and biology have no room for. He was describing a population of people who carried a memory of an origin point that was not terrestrial. And he was describing it as a real, observable, hereditary condition. There are only a few ways to explain what he wrote. The first is that he was making it up, or recording a folk belief with no factual basis. This is the default academic response. But it has to account for the fact that the scribe wrote in a documentary register, included a specific cluster of clinical symptoms, identified physical traits, and referenced the condition as something priests were expected to encounter and be unable to cure. None of that reads like folklore. It reads like a case report. The second explanation is that the scribe was describing a real psychological phenomenon, perhaps a form of dissociative disorder, interpreted through the mythological framework available to him. Under this reading, the remembering sickness is real, but its origin is inside the human mind. The problem is that it does not account for the specificity of the traits the scribe listed. Eyes that respond strangely to bright light, unusual height and slender build. Magnetic sensitivity, dreams of colors that do not exist locally. These are not the standard symptoms of depression or dissociation. They are a specific cluster. The third explanation is the one Aten himself began to entertain in the last years of his life. It is that the tablet is describing exactly what it appears to describe. That there was a population of human beings whose ancestry included beings from outside the earth, and that some descendants carried a residual memory of that origin. The scribe was not writing a myth. He was writing a diagnosis. That is a large claim to make from a single tablet. But the Nippur fragment is not the only text that says something like this. Sumerian and Akkadian literature contains references to a group of beings called the Anunnaki, whose name has been translated as the ones who came down from the sky. These references appear across hundreds of tablets, spanning more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian writing. The Anunnaki are described as arriving in the ancient past, shaping human civilization, and eventually departing in what various tablets call boats of heaven or chariots of fire. Some of the texts say they returned to a place identified by a specific star grouping, which corresponds to the region of sky the Nippur scribe pointed to when he described where afflicted individuals gazed at night. The Nippur tablet fits neatly into that larger picture. It describes descendants. It describes the aftermath. It describes what happens generations after the great ones, as the scribe called them, are gone. If the tablet is right, some of those descendants are still here, and a small percentage of them, at any given moment, are walking through their ordinary lives with a persistent ache for a place they have never seen. Modern people call it something else now: wanderer syndrome, existential displacement, a sense of not belonging on Earth, of being from somewhere else, of having a home they cannot locate but can vividly imagine. Modern psychology treats it as a form of alienation. But the pattern of symptoms is close enough to what the Nippur scribe described that any honest researcher has to ask whether we are looking at the same condition, thousands of years apart, still affecting the same subset of the human population. The researcher who accessed the Munich archive has been gathering case studies of modern individuals who match the profile. As of last year, her sample size was over 300 people, drawn from across 4 continents, none of whom knew the others existed. When asked to describe the place they long for, they produced descriptions that overlap in ways random imagination cannot account for. Similar landscapes, similar colors. A specific quality of light several describe as being like liquid silver, a sense of a home that is warm, that is quiet, that is not here. The Nippur scribe, 4,000 years ago, described the same longing. He said the blood remembered even when the mouth forgot. And he explained, in the sections of the tablet that Aten was able to partially reconstruct exactly what happens to the afflicted individuals over time. The remembering sickness has 3 stages. The first begins in childhood, characterized by the dreams, the gazing at the sky, and a quiet difference from other children. Most parents simply consider the child dreamy or moody. The second stage begins in adolescence, marked by an intensification of the longing, often accompanied by depression, isolation, and a compulsion to search for something the individual cannot name. The third stage occurs in adulthood, and is the most dangerous. It is characterized by what the scribe called a hardening of the ache, in which the longing becomes a permanent feature of the individual's inner life, no longer acute but present as a background hum, coloring everything the person does and thinks. Individuals in the third stage often become obsessed with certain kinds of work that seem to soothe the ache temporarily. The scribe listed them: watching the stars and recording their movements, building things with great precision, working with metals, creating music that involved certain intervals the scribe described as reminders of the other sky, traveling long distances, especially at night, and especially by water, astronomy, precision engineering, metallurgy, music, long-distance travel by night and by water. Those 5 activities, the scribe wrote, temporarily soothed the ache in individuals who suffered from the remembering sickness. Entire families, over generations, would often produce a disproportionate number of astronomers, engineers, metalsmiths, musicians, and navigators, and these families were the ones in which the condition ran most strongly. This is where the tablet stops being merely interesting and starts to feel like it is describing something that has quietly shaped human civilization, because those 5 professions are not random. They are the ones that produce the great leaps in human development. The building of the pyramids required precision engineering. The mapping of the stars required astronomy. Long-distance sea voyages produced the trade networks that connected the first civilizations. If the Nippur scribe was correct, then a significant portion of the driving force behind human civilization has come from individuals suffering from a hereditary condition that gave them an inescapable longing for a place off the earth, building higher, sailing farther, measuring the stars more precisely. Every one of those activities is a form of return, a form of reaching back toward the origin. The rest of the population was content with the world as it was. Only the descendants of the mixed blood were not content. Only they were driven to build, to measure, to sail, to refine, to reach. It was both a gift and a curse. A gift because it produced the pyramids, the star maps, the music, and the voyages. A curse because the individuals themselves were rarely happy, and most of them died, still longing for the place they could not reach. The tablet's final surviving lines contain what Aten called the strangest passage of all. The scribe records what he claims is a direct quotation from an elderly member of one of these families, spoken to a temple priest who had come to visit her in her final illness. The old woman was asked what she felt when she looked at the stars. Her answer was the following: "I do not know the name of the place I want to go back to. I have never seen it with my eyes. But when I close my eyes, I see it perfectly. It is not like this land. The light is different. The air is different. There are 2 shadows on the ground, not one. And someone is waiting for me there, someone I have never met, but who I know is my own. I have lived a long life here. I have loved my children, and my husband, and this land. But when I die, I want to go home. And this is not my home." The scribe wrote that the priest was silent for a long time after she said this, and that he left the house without giving her the blessing he had come to give. In Sumerian religious practice, the failure to bless a dying person was extremely unusual. It suggests the priest did not know how to respond. Her words fell outside every category the religion had built to explain human suffering and death. 2 shadows on the ground, not one. That detail is the kind of thing anyone familiar with basic astronomy will recognize immediately. 2 shadows on the ground would indicate a world with 2 suns, or a world with 1 sun and a companion object bright enough to cast its own shadow. It is not a detail a Sumerian woman living in a single sun system would have any reason to invent. The Nippur tablet does not tell us where that world was, but it does give us the star grouping the affected individuals gazed at. It corresponds most closely to a region of the sky that modern astronomers identify as containing several nearby star systems, including one that has in the last 20 years been confirmed to host planets. Whether any of those planets are habitable is not yet known. What is known is that the Sumerians, 4,000 years ago, pointed to that specific region of the sky when they described where the afflicted individuals looked. The tablet ends with a formula that translates roughly as, "And so it has been recorded." Nothing more. No prescription, no cure. The remembering sickness cannot be treated, it can only be described. Heinrich Otten never published the full translation. In his final notes, written the year before his death, he wrote a single sentence that had summarized his thinking. In German, it reads simply, "If this is real, everything we know about ourselves is incomplete." And if the tablet is what it appears to be, the Sumerians preserved information about the human species that has been almost entirely lost to modern science. That some percentage of the human population is not, in a certain deep and inherited sense, from here. That some of us carry a memory older than any civilization we have built. That some of us are longing for a place not on Earth. The Nippur fragment is now stored in a climate-controlled vault. The Otten notes remain in Munich. In the meantime, the tablet just waits, as it has waited for 4,000 years, for someone to read it and take it seriously. If you are one of the people who has felt, without being able to explain why, that this world is not entirely your world, that there is a place you are trying to remember but cannot quite reach, the Sumerians wrote a small clay tablet in your honor 4,000 years ago. They wrote it because a temple official asked them to catalog a condition they could not cure. Because those who suffer should at least know they are not alone. You are not alone. You have not been alone for a long time. And somewhere, according to the tablet, the ache in your blood is the memory of a home your ancestors left in ships of fire, so long ago that even the stars have shifted since they left. The question the tablet does not answer is whether that home is still there, and if it is still waiting for you.